Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So very briefly, I just want to introduce the panelists that will be speaking today. So we have Gisselle Vélez-Ruiz, which she's the Program Director of Diversity, Education, and Outreach at the Broad Institute. And then Julian Avila-Pacheco, who's a Senior Research Scientist in the Metabolomics platform. And then there's Pauline Serrano, who's the Chemical Hygiene Manager of EHS. And then we have Magdalena Sevilla Gonzalez, who is a postdoc in the metabolism program. Would you guys like to introduce yourself, maybe give a little bit of background on what you studied, where you went to school, and what made you want to go into that field?
I can start. Okay, so my name is Gisselle Vélez. My pronouns are her and she. And my role at the Broad, like Celeste mentioned, I am the Program Director of the Diversity Education and Outreach Office here at the Broad, where we develop and implement programs all to get access to STEM. So my educational background, so I have a bachelor's in chemistry from the University of Puerto Rico with a minor in math. I have a Ph.D. in cell and molecular biology and pharmacology from the University of Michigan. As well as a postdoctoral fellowship in neuroscience at Michigan, where I study spinal cord injury regeneration. So I have a pretty eclectic training background.
Julian, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, my name is Julian Avila. I'm in the Metabolomics platform. I'm a senior scientist there. I actually been at the Broad for 5.5 years. I trained originally as a microbiologist and biologist in my undergrad. That was I double majored at University of Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. That's where I'm originally from. Then I moved to the States, to Texas, to pursue a PhD in biochemistry. And then I did a postdoc in Seattle at the University of Washington for 2 years, also in kind of like biochemistry development. My work during my PhD and my postdoc was particularly centered around plant biochemistry. So I was studying development and how plants interact with pathogens and all these things that sound pretty foreign when you think about what the Broad Institute does. And then there was a transition from my postdoc in plant development to the Broad, where I'm now dealing with small molecules in human biofluids, trying to understand human disease. So as Gisselle mentioned, you know, it's kind of eclectic in her career. Mine has been just as eclectic. It's been kind of all over the place. But it's been pretty stable for the past 5.5 years. So I'm still doing small molecule research at the Broad, and I'm pretty happy with it. So yeah, I think that's sort of my global intro.
Great, thank you. Pauline, would you like to go next?
Sounds good. All right. Hi, my name is Pauline Serrano. My pronouns are she, hers. And I've been at the Broad for almost 3 years. I got my undergrad at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in biochemistry. And then I did a master's at UNLV again, and where I studied nuclear chemistry. So I worked with used nuclear fuel with plutonium and uranium. And then from there, I jumped over to UC Davis to do a PhD in metalloprotein spectrophotometry, spectroscopy work. And then from there, I transitioned out of doing lab science, lab research, to sort of to a more supportive role. And that is how I transitioned over to being a chemical hygiene officer.
Magdalena, how about you?
Hi, how are you, everyone? My name is Magdalena Sevilla. I'm from Mexico. I'm on my 2nd year as a postdoc here at the Broad. Although I came here twice as a research visitor during my graduate school, I have a bachelor's degree in human nutrition at the University of Guadalajara in Mexico. Also, I have a master's and a Ph.D. in clinical nutrition by the National University of Mexico, UNAM, in Mexico City. And my research has been focused on clinical research, most related with metabolic diseases.
Great. So now that we've went through the introductions, would everyone mind sort of giving a little bit of background or explanation of the path that they took to the role that they're in right now? We can start with Gisselle.
Sure. I'm always laughing when I explain this because it's never straight. It's a whole like zigzag curves. So in my case, I was really committed to research. I loved research. I had really broad interdisciplinary training. But when throughout my career, I was always really committed to mentoring and working with students, and I did a lot of outreach work. And for me, a lot of my personal experiences drove what I wanted to do. So I'm a first generation college graduate. Me and my siblings are the first ones to go to college. And I struggled a lot, and I was really fortunate to be part of a lot of programs that kind of empower students with who were marginalized or had identities not represented in science. So that was something that drove me. And then, you know, in my lab, it was at the time, it was like tenure. That's all you were doing. That's all they were pushing me for. And when the time came at the end of my postdoc, where the conversation was like, well, are you going to continue, or are you going to go for more for tenure track jobs? At that point, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I was really struggling. And I took a step back and started thinking, what were the aspects that I really enjoy, that really drove me out? Like, I love the research, but at the end, I was so excited whenever I had students or the outreach programs. And I will make a really long story short, but through a lot of connections, a lot of informal coffees, I ended up getting a part-time job at the graduate school at Michigan, where I started supporting a program that I had done as an undergrad, that it was a summer research opportunity program. And I also work with graduate students from marginalized identities, so students with children, students of color, international students, or just underrepresented communities. And I just really fell in love with it. And that became slowly, like, I kept asking for more hours. I kept having more meetings and learning more about this whole new discipline of social sciences and educational psychology that was super foreign to me, and becoming really comfortable with that research. And that's just what really drove me until a full-time job came up, and I applied, and they knew me. So I was at the graduate school. The office was it was GSS, Graduate Student Services, supporting grad students. And I became the director of the summer program, and it was really exciting, and I loved it. And then how I landed at the Broad, which goes back to the power of networking. A classmate of mine from grad school was here, and somebody told her, oh, we're looking for somebody. Here are the things we're looking for. And she was like, oh, I know somebody. So she sent me an email through LinkedIn, and I was like, the Broad? Like, what is that? Because my research was not in genomics. So I was like, I didn't know what it was. So I came for an interview. I really liked it. Fast forward, and then I'm here. Yeah, and it's been really great. So a lot of zigzags, a lot of panic moments, but we made it work.
I love that. That's a great story. How about Julian? What is the story behind where you ended up?
Sure. I think Gisselle and I have very similar stories in many ways, because I think the transition to the Broad obviously begins when I was doing my postdoc. And from grad school to your postdoc, you're kind of primed to have this vision of a faculty position. But at the time, I kind of knew that it was going to be an uphill battle to get one of those, especially in plant science. Like in biomedical fields, I think you have a bigger market than you do in, let's say, plant, especially basic plant research, because you have agriculture as one thing. But basic plant research is very hard to get a position in certain places. So I had just that vision in mind of, okay, I'm just going to get a bunch of papers out and try to go on the market to get an academic position. And then during my postdoc, it became clear by just seeing the people, other postdocs in the lab who had been there for 5-6 years and were like starting to apply for those positions, that it was going to take me a long time to get to a place where I was marketable to have, you know, an academic position. So after my first year, I started kind of panicking, and I liked what I was doing quite a bit. I really loved the research that I was working on, but then I felt like I had to make a decision for what my career was going to look like. And in my case, I got pushed essentially by the fact that my husband is also an academic, and he was in English, in an English program. And at the time, he started applying for jobs, and then he got an offer here in Massachusetts, at Bridgewater State, south of Boston. So then I kind of got pushed to making that decision right there. And I said, okay, you know, take that job, and I figure something out in the East Coast. And so that became real, and we were apart for, I don't know, like 6 months or so while I was trying to find something here. And as it turns out, just like Gisselle mentioned, I had a friend who worked in grad school with me in Texas, who was getting a postdoc here at the Broad. And he said his boss was looking for someone who could communicate biochemistry, who could manage projects, and who could very quickly learn mass spectrometry and kind of understand the basics of data analysis. So I kind of packed a little email, and I got in touch with him and said, hey, listen, you know, I'm interested. Can we have a talk about this? And we did. And he, if you have ever met the person I work for, Claire Klish, he's a very busy person. It's very hard to get in touch with him. But luckily, I managed to get a hold of him via my friend. He was the one who like kept pushing me, like, hey, you need to get in touch with this guy. You need to get in touch with this guy. So in a sense, my friend became an advocate of me coming to the Broad. And I was a bit skeptical because it was a big transition, right? I was working with plant science, and all of a sudden I was going to move to doing research on human subjects. So we had a couple of long conversations with Larry, where I sort of, and he was very good at kind of trying to assess whether I would be okay with the transition and whether I would be okay sort of moving forward to a field that was completely foreign. And not necessarily because he doubted I could do it, but because he was worried I would just regret it. I would regret jumping from one field to another. And I just felt, okay, you know, it's scary. It's a bunch of new things that I've never done before, but it's an opportunity that, you know, I can't let go. And so I decided to come to the Broad. Larry made me an offer. I came and interviewed and did the whole thing. And of course, the learning curve was pretty steep. Like 6 months in, I was working more than I was working in my postdoc in grad school, but I was also learning more than I had learned in the past 5 years. So it's for sure a decision that I don't regret. Obviously, I'm here 5.5 years later, so something must have worked out.
That's great. I mean, I think it's great that you had a background in something else and you still fell in love with another subject. I feel like that happens to a lot of us throughout our journeys. So Pauline, what about you? What was your story?
Sure. So just like everybody else, I came to the end of the road and didn't want to fight that uphill battle of an academic or tenure track job. So, so I was already looking to transition into something else, and I wasn't quite sure what that was going to be. At the same time, during my 3rd or 4th year of my program, my PI volunteered me for a campus-wide safety committee that was being formed because there had been a terrible accident that led to a death of an undergraduate at UCLA. And since we were part of the UC system, there was a huge overhaul of safety throughout the entire UC system. And so they wanted to have like subject matter experts in these reagents to really form and write policies around them. So And so that's sort of, so I found myself gravitating more towards that work. And then I was lucky enough to be hired as a TA, to be like the safety deputy for the chemistry department. And so that gave me like hands-on training of like what the job would actually entail. And then I was hired at the university at UC Davis as the associate chemical hygiene officer right out of grad school. And but when you graduate from grad school, you don't apply to just one job, you apply to a billion jobs. And so in one of those jobs, I actually applied to MIT, the Lincoln Lab, which is like their top secret government lab that they have over in Lexington. And so, so I get a phone call, long story short, they pay for us to move, they give me the job and they pay for us to move across the country. And my partner is like, all right, I guess we're gonna be Boston, Massachusetts people. And so as part of my contract with MIT, I had to be working there for a year. However, I was minding my own business, working at MIT, and then I get this message on LinkedIn, and I was like, the Broad, what is this? Like, again, my research wasn't in genomics or anything, so I had never heard of the institute. So I reach out to a friend who's really plugged into that type of research here in Cambridge, and he's like, I would sit down and listen to their offer. I would sit down and listen to what they have to say because, they're like this leader in the industry. And so the Broad basically poached me from MIT. They bought me out of my contract and I started as the chemical hygiene manager, and it's been like magical ever since. I really love working here, and that's sort of how I transitioned my career from research into safety.
When I was in undergrad, I felt really passionate about creating my own knowledge and sharing with others. So after my undergrad, I was completely sure that I wanted to pursue an academic career. So I moved out to Mexico City, from Guadalajara to Mexico City for my graduate program. And in my graduate program, I had an incredible mentor, Carlos Aguilar. Carlos Aguilar is part of the SLIM, of the Sigma Consortium, which is a SLIM Foundation supported program and for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. And during my graduate training, I was supported by the Sigma Foundation to come here at the Broad for 2 research stays, one in 2016 and the other in 2018. So during my research scholar visits, I met with several persons here at the Broad, particularly with my current mentor, Alisa Manning. I shared in my first research stay, I shared the office with her, and then we became friends and we kept in touch. So that was very helpful to me for later on ask her for a postdoctoral position. And she already knew me, so it was easier to get the contact and trying to pursue the same research objectives of my past trainings. So, and the reason why I choose to be in this diabetes or metabolic diseases field was the fact that when I was in graduate, my mom was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is an incredibly prevalent condition in Mexico and Latin populations as well. And I remember that she told me that what I will have liked to know 15 or 20 years before I knew I had type 2 diabetes. And that really makes me feel that I needed to do something about that to improve the knowledge or the treatment in order to create an impact in the population. And that's the reason why I'm studying type 2 diabetes. And that's the reason why I landed up at the Broad Institute.
So on a normal daily basis, what would you say your day-to-day tasks look like for someone that may be interested in the field you work in? Can we start with Gisselle?
Sure. So the work I do is kind of interesting. There's common themes. So like email, a big part of my job is like grant writing, which I always joke was the thing I hated in science and I thought I was leaving out. Now it's the thing I have to do the most in my role. And working with students, but the fun part is we have a lot of programs and they're kind of cyclical. So the summers are super busy. So any days from like meeting with students, meeting with my colleagues to develop content, meeting with evaluators to discuss the impact of our programs, to now where we are more in what I call the academic year, where I have the postdocs and other students like coming into my office all the time, wanting to talk about grad school, participating. I'm pretty fortunate that I have been able to participate in various of our affinity groups like Shades and out at Broad. So a lot of meetings, a lot of emails, a lot of people interactions. And it used to be now virtual. It made it a little bit challenging, but I used to try to attend some program meetings like an infectious disease or the cancer program, for example, just because I still love to hear that. And I like to be informed. And even my partner, who's a scientist, sometimes will still ask me about experiments. And I'm just like, I haven't held up my pen that long, but I kind of remember. So that's, it's kind of fun to be in a place like this.
I do obviously have to use email to get in touch with people because a lot of my work depends on collaborations with other researchers. Many of the projects that we're running the platform. I don't know if people are completely familiar with what platforms are at the Broad, but we function sort of as a glue, providing technologies that researchers don't necessarily have access to in their own labs because of different reasons. In the case of metabolomics, is sort of the cost of instrumentation can be prohibitive for people to run on their own. So we work with many people, and part of my day-to-day involves getting in touch with them and sort of talking about how the technology works, what type of data we generate, whether it matches their questions or their hypotheses, or maybe guiding them in trying to figure out if we are the best way to answer the questions. I also spend a significant amount of time going over data, so cleaning up data sets, crunching numbers, sharing the data with people, helping them analyze the data. I was not a data scientist, but I kind of become one when I got here. So I had to learn a couple of programming languages. I work a lot with R, and I use that to sort of crunch numbers and generate visualizations for people. And then there's still a lab component. I still go in the lab. I have my bench, I have my lab coat, my pipette set, and my projects are either things that we are interested in the platform. Sometimes I run things for other people. So if someone has samples that is an emergency, they need to measure something, I will, and there's no bandwidth in the lab, I'll go in and do it. But a lot of the improvement of our methods in the platform, I'm working on currently, trying to find new metabolites or discover new molecules that we didn't have before. I don't do much grant writing. I do some grant reviewing and editing. Most of the grant writing is done by Clary, my boss. I do put together figures and collect preliminary data for those grants, which I'm more comfortable with. I do like writing, but sometimes I just prefer someone else to do it. So yeah, that's my day-to-day. I think it's a pretty balanced mix of being at my desk in front of my computer, but also being in the lab and doing things in the lab.
That's great. So just a little bit of everything. Best of all the worlds. What about you, Pauline?
So I'm basically in a researcher support role. So I'm at sort of the researchers, whatever questions, requests they may have. So that's sort of my primary role, is just being there to support researchers for any requests that they make, whether it's chemical, procurement, storage, disposal, use even. I've trained Broadies on how to use particularly hazardous materials. I'll generate training, I'll give training, And biannually, we do lab inspections. And so we'll actually be in the labs talking to researchers, doing sort of walking through and inspecting everything. And with the chemistry heavy groups, I actually do a weekly walkthrough with them just because their needs are a lot higher than sort of like the BL1 spaces and stuff, since they don't use particularly anything too hazardous. And so, yeah, and then part of that is the Broad didn't have a chemical safety program until I arrived. And so part of that was building the chemical safety program. So I moderate and I run the chemical safety committee that whether you love it or hate it, instituted the lab coat and safety glasses for all Brodies. So just because, you know, we want to make sure that we're being compliant with everything. And so we look at other issues like chemical inventories and other chemical safety issues that haven't been addressed, and make sure that we're sort of being proactive to accidents instead of reactive to accidents. So we have like the majority of injuries that we have at the Broad are sharps. And so that's why everybody now has to take sharps training, because there was just that many incidents. And so we're trying to think of ahead. We're trying to be a couple steps ahead in terms of safety for all of our researchers to make sure that everybody stays safe. And currently I'm working towards getting certification to be a certified safety professional. And so, and then that gives me more tools in my skill set to be able to keep researchers safe, to make sure that they're not being exposed to any hazardous chemicals, whether it's through fume hoods or biosafety cabinets. There's just a lot to think about. And so I'm just kind of learning more, and yeah, that's kind of what I do every day.
Well, thank you for the work you do keeping us all safe. I know that now getting to wear lab coat and safety glasses, I think that should have been implemented a long time ago. So thank you for doing that. What about you, Magdalena?
Most of the time I run tons of statistical analysis over and over again. Also, I do some work of grant writing and academic writing for my papers and others collaborators' papers. And I attend several meetings, particularly those for collaborators, and also for the meetings of the biggest consortia, such as TopMed or Charge meetings. But most of my day is also reading papers, trying to understand my results, or trying to understand or giving a biological meaning to my my results, my statistical results. So it's kind of work of collaboration, but at the same time, more analytical work. And I think I like it. I think, well, I'm convinced I like it.
That sounds great. So another question I have for the panelists is, and some of you may have touched on this briefly, but what other aspects of your job do you really enjoy? And is there any that you don't enjoy that come with the job?
So I really like working with students in all the different stages, like the K through 12, the undergrads, the postbacs, and hearing from them about their next step in their careers, and hearing that we had a little part in that, and to get them continue that trajectory in STEM, that's like super rewarding. I love collaborating and meeting other folks here at the Broad and learning about the science. I think one of the things it's really challenging about the work that we do, it's like funding. So a big thing, it's like I'm always either writing grants or constantly being proactive about funding so we can keep our staff, so we can keep our programs free of cost. So that's a little bit stressful. And some which are part of every organization, like some of the structures to navigate, right? Like I feel, especially as scientists, we just want to get it done. And just getting used to a lot of things that move slower than I'm used to, and being able to understand how to operate within a structure, that's something that can be really frustrating. But again, that's something that I think every job has, because we just want to do our thing. But just being able to support the students while being connected to the science, it's really the part that I like.
Yeah, you've been a huge part of my journey here at the Broad, so thank you. What about you, Julian?
I think one of the things I enjoy the most is the ability to interact with researchers in multiple disciplines. So we have people working with cancer, diabetes, infectious disease, and everyone always comes to the table with some amazing ideas and some amazing preliminary data. So it's really exciting to just sit down with someone who's A, really smart, and B, has been working really hard on a particular question, and be able to offer a tool or technique that allows them to take that to a different level, and seeing the excitement when you find new things that were never been, described before. So I think that that's sort of the biggest reward of my position, is the fact that I'm always exposed to new things, new ideas, new techniques, and it keeps me sort of up to date on many fields at the same time. The one thing that I think sometimes bothers me, and it doesn't happen that often, but when it happens, it's kind of annoying, is when you're working with too many people and have so many projects, there's a risk of getting people using what you've done and not really acknowledging the efforts that you put into it. So, and that happens sometimes with people acquiring the data in the lab, RAs who are working really hard and are part of this scientific process, but they may get overlooked when a publication comes out. And that's sort of the one thing that I'm just always trying to negotiate with people from the very beginning, saying, okay, we're a collaborator, we're not a core, we're not your employee, we're here to discover things together. And there's some amount of effort that we're putting into things that should be recognized. And that's, I would say that's, I think, the one thing that bothers me, but it happens very rarely, and I kind of get over it quickly.
That's great to know. What about you, Pauline?
So what I love the most, and this may sound kind of bizarre, is thinking of worst case scenarios. So when researchers order a hazardous chemical, I have to think of, because they come to the table with these, like Julian says, with these grand ideas. They're like, I want to do this thing and I want to do this experiment. And I have to sort of step back and think of say this goes off the rails, say they heat it up too much, and it's like it has a huge exothermic reaction that goes off control and they can't control it. Like, do we have all the emergency precautions in place to make sure that that doesn't happen, or to make sure that everybody is safe in case that does happen? So so that's one thing that I like. I love interacting with the researchers. I love being able to support them in their grand ideas. And one thing, and so that's really what I like. And so it kind of keeps me consistently learning, and it keeps me, like Julian said, up to date on techniques, on research protocols. And then what I dislike is there's a lot of paperwork. We have to keep track of like fire permits that have to get filed twice a year. We have to keep track of controlled substances. We have to file licenses for the Department of Homeland Security. We have like a toxins license. And so there's a lot of paperwork. And so our admin is amazing and does an incredible job. And so she just got promoted to systems coordinator, which I'm so glad, but without her, we would be lost, or I would be lost. So that's the give and take.
Yeah, so I mean, it's great that I feel like everyone has a passion for what they do, and I feel like the negatives, like, they always come with a job, but I feel like you are all working to really enjoy those aspects of the job as well. Magdalena, what about you? What do you like and not like about?
I really, really enjoyed creating my own knowledge and sharing with other scientists. And at the same time applying their methods and understand very complex biological process through the data interpretation. I found this very, very exciting for me. Also, I really enjoy when my knowledge, with the knowledge that I created, can be translatable to improve people's treatment. I think that is very, very, very rewarding for me. And something that I don't like, I think I agree with Julian, it's definitely annoying not getting acknowledged or at least that support with from your collaborators, particularly in this stage of my career, where also when I was in my graduate school, it can be sometimes annoying not having that acknowledgement, but such is life.
Have you identified any circumstances where your heritage benefits you, or maybe does it provide an obstacle? For example, did it benefit you while applying to fellowships, or did it heavily influence your choice of work for the mentor chosen for your program? And how did you get through those obstacles?
Yeah, I'll start. So it's interesting. I guess we'll start with the benefits. So, right, like I think for me, my identity is as a Latino, it's like part of who I am. So he drove a lot of the things I pursue, like the activities, the networks, in terms of like grants and fellowships, or that kind of like professional advantage. In all honesty, maybe there were some grants that were targeted for various communities that have been marginalized in science, like people of color, women in science. But I would say that's the extent. If anything, I would say it put me at a disadvantage. And I share this story with my postdocs all the time about how I was struggling in a class my first year, and somebody made a comment about me getting in because of affirmative action, or me being really self-conscious because in a lot of spaces I was the only female, or the only female of color, particularly like in my lab, I was the first female that had ever joined. So things like that, and the only person of color. So it made it slightly challenging in that there was an implicit and sometimes explicit comments that made me that I have to prove myself, that I actually earned my spot, that I was on the diversity hired. And yeah, maybe it opened up to some grants that were rightly so trying to change that dynamic of what is a scientist or who is in science. But I don't think like anything that I can go back and be like a measurable like benefit, like, oh, I'm Latino, thus I got this. No, it might have opened, but still had to apply. And I would dare say, as somebody who has now reviewed grants, like I feel it's just even more like you push yourself harder because you want to demonstrate that you deserve it. And then tactics, you know, have a good, that goes for everything, like a good network of people. I had friends that we would get together. I had different groups of Latino people of color, other folks who had similar struggles, and we would get together just to vent or give each other feedback or help each other if science career wise. So that's something that's been super helpful. And now that goes through here, like finding people who understand or seek to understand some of the challenges and are open to learning has been really instrumental. Plus the beautiful complexion that I get a tan, that's a plus. And I'm, yeah.
Does anybody else want to chime in on their experience?
Sure, I can do. So it's a hard question, right? And I always think about this. I always think about, okay, how am I as a Latino perceived? Are people constantly judging my accent and trying to figure out whether I know what I'm talking about because of it, or what I look like, or where I come from? And like Gisselle mentioned, I think that creates this anxiety that's pushed me to, oh my gosh, I have to be the best. You know, I have to do really hard work and go beyond what everyone else is doing. And that sometimes is not good for you. And it's hard for me to sort of toss that aside and say, okay, you know, this is enough. Like I don't have to prove myself every step I take. I never experienced any weird issues for being Latino, at least not that I've noticed. Other than like one of my PIs trying to put me in a grant because I was Hispanic and saying, oh, this is just really good because we have better odds of getting the grant if I mentioned that. So I felt like, okay, how is this benefiting me other than you get funding, right? So it just felt kind of strange. The one thing I would say, and I just started thinking about this recently, is that in being Latino, I've been pulled, and this is through my PhD and postdoc and here at the Broad, I get pulled into lots of service panels geared towards trying to figure out how diversity can be improved and how to make institutions better environments for people who look like me. And although those things can be a burden, I think they allow me to meet a lot of people and learn about the institutions where I was. And I think that's something that, had I not been Hispanic, I would have not had that opportunity, but also the need would have been there. So in many ways, I interact with a lot of people outside of my bubble in metabolomics because of the way I look and because of my experiences. And it comes at a cost, right? Like we're putting time and effort, and Pauline, you probably know about this, and Gisselle, you as well. Like we get pulled in all these directions, and we're getting involved with people who are very passionate about diversity and that. And that is a burden, but it's also kind of a blessing in disguise because you're meeting a lot of people, you're networking, you're getting your face out there, you're becoming part of the community and the institution. And I think maybe that's something that is very intrinsic to us Latinos. We tend to like get very close to people, but I think that in many ways has shaped my Latino-ness has shaped that interaction with people. And I'm done.
I can chime in for just a quick. UC Davis is actually has one of the highest Latinx matriculating classes for undergrad and graduate students. And so they're truly committed to, URMs. And so, so that was really great. And I immediately got in contact with them and became a mentor and got involved with them. And so that was sort of a tactic that I used, but in my own career, there were no professors of color. There were no BIPOC professors in the chemistry department or even in adjacent departments. And so that was really difficult because there was zero representation. And so that was really difficult. And I don't know if maybe that also played why I didn't want to go into academia, because I didn't see someone like myself represented that way. But opportunities that I was offered, I actually applied and was an Alfred was a Sloan Fellow. And so that offered me a ton of money that like allowed me to go to conferences, to self-fund myself so that I didn't have to TA certain quarters. So that was like one really huge like benefit, because it's mainly for BIPOC populations. And so that was really helpful.
And for me, I will add that having this different perspective, I can add or improve the research by giving a more diverse focus. For example, for me in TopMed, I mean, it's very helpful for me just always trying to put this diversity topic on the research that I'm doing or the proposals that I'm giving, because sometimes I know that I can provide a completely different perspective about the environmental factors or the socioeconomic status or any other things. So I don't know if that benefit directly to me, but at least at the research, I think it definitely helps to perform a better research.
Great, thank you everyone for chiming in on that question. There's also another question from the audience that's, so how did you get through being in grad school where there are so few Latinos, and were you able to build a community?
I'll start, and I guess I'll be brief in the interest of time. There's another question. So I think there's two things of this. One, so I like taking advantage or seeking out, like all campuses will have like student groups, will do events. Like there was a SACNAS chapter at Michigan. So that's the Society of Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans. It's a big group. Or just going, I was part of the Students of Color. That was another group. So just being really proactive and stepping out of that box and finding those 2 or 3 people that I could rely on. And I think for me, and it's something that I still do at my job, it can be really hard to get caught up in what I'm missing. Like I wish, of course, there were more people of color from all and more identities where I work and in general, right? But there needs to be work, and work is slow. So I feel that just by being here and using my voice to that's helpful to bring more. Because if I were to be like, well, I'm checking out because I'm the only person of color in this particular grad program or this, then I'm doing myself a disservice because I'm taking myself out of the, out of the game, if you will, with the understanding that self-care and taking care of myself is super important. I'm not telling you to go suffer, but I'm telling you that especially you're always going to find yourself as part of the minority group in a lot of circumstances, and you'll just become better at working through it or just thinking about it from a different perspective and having people who support you in other ways, in other spaces. Sorry, I want to be brief to give others the time. Paulina, Juliano, Magdalena.
I can say, well, in grad school, I was in Texas, so it was pretty easy making Latino friends in Texas. But I would say, I think there's different affinities, right? And as Gisselle said, I'm Hispanic, but I make friends with whoever I click with, and I build networks around that. Also, a queer man, I also have access to a different community that I have affinities with, and that was a good way for me to just find different cliques of people. I tend to just hang out with whoever I click with.
I formed a group of, there weren't a lot of, in my class, there were, I think, 6 of us. And so I formed a impromptu monthly lunch with these folks, because once you get into your labs, you really never see each other. You're just like in lab. So we would go grab like coffee or a lunch and just kind of debrief and just kind of like talk about, everything. And sometimes it was just nice to be able to talk in Spanish around each other.
Well, I did my PhD in Mexico, so.
So from your stories, several of you learned of Broad through a connection who worked here. How can LatinX at Broad support making these connections continue to happen? And how can we support building a stronger pipeline for LatinX researchers at Broad?
Reach out to my community, like for different, I post the jobs on LinkedIn, and I reach out to any Latinx researchers that I know that are talented and that would be a really good fit. And so that's kind of how I support the pipeline, to continue to build our Latinx community here at the Broad.
I will say that sharing our story, that can inspire others, or at least trying to help others with their own journey in case they are interested in following a similar path.
I think Rafael touches an important point, and it is really important to have an advocate for you, someone who knows your work, someone who knows what you're capable of in a situation. Like if I had someone I worked with or I had mentored in the past and I knew what they were capable of, I would be a huge advocate for them. So what comes to mind is I participated in the summer undergrad mentoring program that Gisselle steers. And I had the opportunity to work with this undergrad from Puerto Rico for about 2 months. And I've been in touch with him. And this is one thing that if he wanted to come work to the Broad, I would be a huge advocate for him to do so. So it's kind of identifying for us who are here, the Broad, is identifying those people who you think would benefit from the institution, who are aligned in their skills, and kind of like coaching them and in a certain way, like lobbying it for be here. But if we don't have those connections, perhaps what Shades or LatinX Broad could do is, how do we build connections with current Broad researchers and employees, with Latinx trainees in the area or in the country? And how do we establish those bridges? And perhaps Gisselle has, since Gisselle is part of this program, it's a good way to kind of create some sort of mentoring around that topic. I don't know what the details would look like.